History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
It's time for Dave Bowman and Dave Does History as we are in the midst of our Liberty 250 series, taking us up to July 4th of next year, which will be the 250th anniversary of this country. And we're exploring the things that led up to it, starting with the grievances laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Dave, again, appreciate all the work you do digging this stuff up and bringing it to us. Where are we going this morning, pal?
We asked the question earlier, and we ask it again now. If the people want something done by government, but government says no, or even worse, simply just refuses to acknowledge your request, just ignores you, how does that make you feel as a citizen? Do you just shrug and say, well, that's politics, or do you feel that familiar frustration, that sense that those in power don't care, aren't listening? Maybe it feels a little bit like being ignored by an adult when you were a kid, standing there with something important to say, only to watch them wave you off. Maybe it feels worse. Maybe it's somebody holding your future in their hands and deliberately dropping it in the trash. That's how the American colonialists felt in the years leading up to 1776. And this is where Thomas Jefferson begins the case against George III. We talked about the preamble. And those final words in the preamble, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Here's why we're doing this. Here's the reasons that have caused this. Now, we tend to remember the Declaration of Independence for its soaring language. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. Those are lines that school kids memorize. They're ones that Congress reads. They're the ones, when they read the Declaration of Independence, you notice that they always skip the grievances. These are the lines that we remember. They make us swell with pride. But Jefferson doesn't stop with poetry. The bulk of the document, 2/3 of it, isn't high philosophy at all. It's a list of grievances. It is a list of accusations against the king that were meant to prove to the world that Britain had become tyrannical. He wanted no confusion on this point, and to that end, he wrote, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Not theories, not arguments, not speculation, facts, cold, hard, and specific. These are the reasons why Americans had to break away. The list begins with something that doesn't sound really dramatic at first, but it was the core of our anger. Jefferson wrote, quote, he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, unquote. Now, if you think about that, of all the abuses, all the complaints, Jefferson chose to open the list with this one. Not taxes, not quartering of soldiers, not mercenaries, not blockades, not even bombarding our cities. The first accusation is that the king refused to let the colonies govern themselves by enacting laws they believed were essential to their welfare. And that is the heart of the matter.
And we continue in 60 seconds on WMMV. So, Dave, we're going to lay this out. And so the king, did he not want the colonists feeling like they could make their own laws? Is it, this is going to lead to what it led to?
There is almost a disconnect.
Now you're turned on. Go ahead.
There is a disconnect really between the colonies and England. We've talked about King George at great length. King George, as far as the English goes, and if you read the English histories of this event, they're very apologetic. They're very, King George was not a tyrant kind of thing. But he has a different attitude towards the colonies, where Parliament and tradition have held that maybe the rights of the English Constitution and the English Bill of Rights don't apply like they do in England. Well, of course, we didn't think that. We believed ourselves to be Englishmen, and we're subject to those same rights. In fact, this is something that we say quite a bit. But legally, it's the law. That's kind of murky in England in 1775. For many years, over 100 years, England has practiced a policy that is known as statutory neglect, which basically says you know what? As long as those people are sending us stuff, that we like, we'll just leave them alone. And rather than govern us, they sort of let us govern ourselves, which is what we were used to. We had legislative assemblies. Starting in the early 1600s, Virginia's first assembly would meet. And these legislative assemblies were our voices, the people's voices here, passing laws to deal with local needs. There's no way Parliament can pass a law in London to decide what we need to do in, say, Norwich, Connecticut. They don't know what kind of roads we need. They don't know what kind of property disputes we might have. They don't know what we need for a militia. They don't even know what we need for trade or monetary. So we would pass these laws. But by 1775, the early 1700s even, England had started to pull back from statutory neglect, and that meant that every law that our colonial legislators passed had to pass a series of hurdles. First, the legislature had to pass it, and as we know from legislatures today, that's not always an easy thing to get a legislature to pass a law, even if the people want it, or sometimes legislatures will pass laws that the people don't want and want no part of. Influence and those kinds of things happen. Even if the legislature managed to pass a law, though, then it had to go to the royal governor. Now, the royal governor would be appointed by the king. This is somebody like Thomas Hutchinson in Massachusetts, who then had to decide to allow the law to go forward or to veto it himself. So the governor could then veto the law and say, no, you're not doing that. I don't like that, and I speak for the king here. But even if the governor did approve it, he could then say, well, let's send it on to England, 6 to 8 weeks away, for further review. And there it would go to what was known as a Privy Council, which is we don't have time to go into the whole English government thing, but Privy Councillors are appointed by the king, and it's a committee that could allow the law as it is. They could strike it down, or they could just ignore it, just let it sit. And if you let it sit, well, you keep writing letters. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Are we moving? No, we don't know. These laws that the colonial leaders believed were wholesome and necessary, London often saw them as inconvenient, defective, or worse, contrary to British interests. And the result was paralysis. The government refused to move on the very issues that the people who were living there thought the most urgent. So this kind of ticked us off. There's this long record of laws annulled by the crown. Oh, by the way, and then it could even go to the king, and the king could say yea or nay. So even got that far. The British would state various reasons. They got to protect the royal prerogative, whatever that means, defend the Anglican church practices. The law is the law, safeguard trade. But from the colonist perspective, this is pure tyranny. You've got a local law to repair roads, regulate land sales, whatever, only to be told that it has to sit in London for review 3, 4, 5 years before word returns. And even then, the word might be no. Jefferson himself had written an earlier pamphlet called A Summary of the Rights of British Americans, in which he fumed that the king was permitted to allow our laws to just lie neglected in England for years, neither confirming them by his assent nor annulling them by his negative. In a lot of ways, Bill, that's worse. This just limbo thing is worse than a yes or even a no. It
conveyed that what's going on here was unimportant, right?
Right. It's like we don't care. We're just not going to let you do that. This is why Jefferson called these laws wholesome and necessary. To the colonials, these are not just abstract political ideas. These are everyday rules that keep society running, that the king, the parliament, the Privy Council, the governor are blocking, delaying, or vetoing, and it's inconvenient. The evidence that they're being treated not as full citizens of the empire, but rather as children, wards, dependents, whose judgment could not be trusted. It's humiliating. It's unjust. you got to ask the question, do we see kind of the same thing today? Do we ever experience government that refuses assent to laws that people broadly consider to be wholesome and necessary? Now, if you're shaking your head yes, you're not alone. In fact, this is probably one of the biggest frustrations in America today. Not that government passes too many laws, but that sometimes they don't do the laws that we actually need. And we could argue about what those laws might be. Any way you look at this, it would become our breaking point. The king does not give his assent to our laws, which are wholesome and necessary. And we don't like that.
And we pick it up from there in just moments here on WMMB with Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
Dave Bowman joins us for our weekly dive into history. Pay attention, there will be a test. No, there won't be a test, but you will be held accountable. Bill Mick Live.
Thank you, Victor Lyle. The McPherson Financial Group brings you this hour. Headline at BillMick.com, coffee, crosswalks, and the Constitution. And there's a link there. You'll see it highlighted with Dave Bowman's name to Dave's work with Dave Does History, What the Frock, and other things Dave is into. So that can link you up to everything Dave Bowman as he continues with Liberty 250 in this hour of the program today. All right, Dave, where are we sitting now, sir?
So Jefferson has made it clear that he's upset, that we're upset about this lack of assent of laws. And again, to us today, it sounds quaint. We don't really understand it for the most part, but this is at the heart of the matter. An unresponsive government is a problem. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about 1776 or 2025. If you imagine how that must feel, your state legislature passes a bill. You're going to fund some roads, or maybe you're going to build some schools or improve public safety somewhere. The governor, he has the right to look at it, and your governor says, okay, that's fine. But then this bill gets shipped off across the ocean, and you have to wait 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to get an answer, and then the answer may be, we're still thinking about it. It's not that there's a time limit, it's just, if we get to it, we get to it, but no, we're not going to do it. It just lingers in limbo. And how does that affect your local stuff? I mean, if you've passed a law allocating funds to do a certain thing, or if you've passed a law to have a certain thing happen on a certain time, and the government just ignores that, how does that make you feel? You're going to be ticked off. I mean,
you're going to ask, what are you paying taxes for?
Exactly. Especially since we have no representation in the matter. And this is what Jefferson is calling out. He's not just complaining that the king is not allowing our laws to happen, not just the denial, but this neglect. Laws the colonists considered urgent were left to rot on desks thousands of miles away. If we even got to that point, each law that was passed by the colonials was required to have what was known as a suspending clause. Now, this is especially infuriating to Americans because the governors were instructed to require that certain colonial laws include a clause stating that they would not take effect until the king himself, King George, approved them. So even if the assembly, the governor agreed, the law was suspended until London had weighed in. It's a leash, plain and simple. That's all it is. It guaranteed that anything the crown thought was important would not go into effect without the king's direct say-so. The results, of course, are delay, uncertainty, and a constant reminder that colonial authority and colonial autonomy is more illusion than it is reality.
Back to Dave Bowman and more. Dave Does History.
The colonialists saw this whole delay tactic as not just insulting, but it made you feel as a colonialist like you just don't matter. Nobody cares about you. They have a law that says you can't do anything unless we say you can, and then they never get back to you. It's a very frustrating thing. It's an insult, and it's a deliberate signal that you don't matter. it's not, by the way, just the American revolutionaries who hate this suspending clause. The royal governors didn't like it either. They thought it was unjust, unpractical, leaving them unable to govern effectively. I mean, what's the point of me being a governor if I can't approve a law that you're just going to sit on? Massachusetts flat out refused to adopt the suspending clause, by the way. They said no. The legislature there insisted that their laws should stand unless the king actively said no. Unless the king vetoed them, this law stands. To them, it's absurd to suspend the law indefinitely. Imagine trying to run a colony when the most...
Did your governor go along with that?
Hutchinson? Kind of.
But, I mean, his being there is at the will of the king. So,
right.
Yeah.
It's one of those, who do I really work for here? But then again, as a human being, your ego is kind of in the play here. If I'm the governor, if I'm just here to rubber stamp everything you're doing, I mean, I guess depending on how much you pay me, I'll do it, but I'm not really that excited about it. Imagine trying to run a colony where the most basic things, roads, taxes, defense, hung up for years because of a clause written in London. Colonies weren't wrong to see that as neglect. Now here's where it gets interesting today. Neglect can be every bit as destructive as outright veto. We see that literally all the time today from our federal government. A bill is introduced, it's debated, even passed in one chamber, and then it just dies. It's buried in committee. Leadership refuses to bring it to the floor. You've seen that in Florida. Or it gets lost in endless reviews. The law never gets a straight yes or a no. It vanishes into the swamp of gridlock. Sound familiar? That's exactly the complaint Jefferson had in 1776. The king didn't have to say no. He only had to do nothing. We've watched immigration reform here in the United States. And again, I'm not arguing the politics of it, but the back and forth and how each house of Congress refuses to deal with the other side. What about judges? We're talking about this whole justice thing and 100 Trump nominees and blue slipping. Now you get one person from one state can say, I don't give my assent to that. And the entire thing gets hung up. Or it just goes into a committee hearing and we sit for how many months now before stuff gets done? Is that frustrating to us as modern Americans? Is it just as damaging to the way we're trying to do stuff? Is it better to have your government come right out and say no, or worse, to have them just do nothing? The colonialists said that neglect was tyranny. Do we feel the same way when Congress leaves urgent matters unresolved for years on end? When the people say a law is wholesome and necessary, and government just leaves it hanging there, aren't we right back in 1776 again, waiting on a government, a king, a president, a Congress that never gets back to us? This is why this particular grievance gets put at the top of the list. It's not just about one specific law or another. As I said, it's not about quartering. It's not about the fact that he sent his navy to bombard our coastline and kill people. You'd think that'd be at the top of the list. I mean, he declared war on us, right? I mean, that should be reason enough. No. Our philosophy is he's neglecting us. He's treating us like we don't matter. And that in and of itself is a government that no longer serves its citizens. It's a lesson we still wrestle with today. And it's a lesson that we should learn well.
Well, and it seems like we just relive parts of this, as you noted, in Florida, in D.C. I guess we don't get as frustrated as the Colonials did, at least not as quickly. We're back with more Dave Does History in a moment on WMMB.
Call Bill now, 321-768-1240.
Podcast for the show, top of the page at BillMick.com. Bill Mick Live Podcast, Florida Roundtable Podcast are there as well. We've got links for you on the show page to all of Dave's podcast and his work there. And on the Florida Roundtable this weekend, our guest was Representative Mike Herodopoulos, as we talked about representing Florida in Washington, D.C., kind of related to what we're talking about here. What kind of voice do we have and how effective is it? And very interesting conversation with Mike. If you missed the roundtable this weekend, catch it top of the page there at billmick.com in the podcast section. Dave, as Jefferson wrote these words, he was making a case, and it almost sounds like to me, here's the case. This is not something that we wanted. This is something you made necessary, King, by your action or lack thereof.
Yeah, we write these down, but we don't want the world to just think these guys just don't like King George. We had to show that he had broken the contract between ruler and ruled. Government exists, we argued, to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when it stops doing those things, when it actively undermines those things, it loses its legitimacy. This is why the grievances, and we're on number 1 and 2 of 27, matter. Not just then, but even today. They're not just about one stubborn king. They're about the foundation of how people are supposed to be governed. Now, when we finally hammer out a constitution 12 years, into the future, we're going to build safeguards against those very abuses Jefferson had described. We're going to separate the powers so that no one branch can unilaterally decide the fate of laws. Congress writes them, passes them, the president can veto them, but that veto can then be overridden. Courts can review them.
We're going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow, with courts overriding executive decisions of President Trump, and how right or wrong are they? That's going to be part of our Wide Open Wednesday. Just to interject. Sorry.
It's an interesting argument, isn't it? Because, again, we think we built in these systems to stop that. The vetoes can be overridden, courts can review them, but even that process supposedly has boundaries. Governors cannot simply refuse to assent to a state law indefinitely. They can't stuff legislation in a drawer and leave it to rot. In short, the system that we will design is designed to prevent neglect, the very thing that we're complaining about with King George. It's meant to ensure that the people's representatives had a real say and that the executive branch could not behave like a king sitting on the laws. That's the principle. Of course, in practice, it might look a little bit different when you fast forward 2.5 centuries. Many Americans feel like we're kind of fighting the same battles, aren't we? Ask around, you'll hear the same complaints. Congress doesn't listen. Politicians ignore the will of the people. How many times do we talk about politicians are bought and sold? They're not listening to us. They're listening to people that give them money. Laws everyone agrees are necessary never get the light of day. Jefferson's grievances start to sound less like an 18th century relic and more like last night's news broadcast. This is kind of what I was saying a couple of weeks ago about the relevance of the Declaration of Independence. It's timeless because when government ceases to be what it's supposed to be, the people have the right and they have the duty to make those changes. You think about all the laws that have gone on, all the debates, all the arguments that have gone on just in the last 10 years in our country. How many of them actually reached any kind of actual resolution? Talk about infrastructure. Okay, it doesn't really matter where you stand on infrastructure. We passed a bill some time ago to fix infrastructure. It didn't. But we all talk about it. But the legislation languishes. It doesn't get the actual thing that we need done doesn't get done. We announce plans, we draft bills, but this most wholesome and necessary laws that we actually need just kind of get left in limbo and nothing ever actually happens. We talk about executive overreach. A lot of people talking about that today. The colonists complain about the governors acting on the king's behalf, vetoing or suspending laws at will. Today, a lot of people criticize presidents for behaving the same way. Yes, people on the left are criticizing Trump for it today. 5 years ago, those of us on the right were criticizing Biden for the same thing. Before that, we were criticizing Obama. Before that, they were criticizing Bush. This tension is the same. Who decides what's wholesome and necessary? The people's representatives or the executive? The influence of wealth is involved here. Jefferson and Colonials complained about the royal prerogative. The ideas of the king's will outweighed the people's needs. In our time, many Americans believe that role has been taken over by money. Studies have shown that when economic elites favor a policy, it has a much higher chance of becoming law. When ordinary citizens favor a policy, but the elites, the economic elites, oppose it, what happens? It feels like another form of refusal to assent, not by a king, but by a new aristocracy, probably of wealth. But the effect is the same. Wholesome laws die, blocked not by reasonable debate, not by an actual vote, but by power and influence. And this is where Jefferson's language rings especially loud today. He didn't say that the king had refused his assent to frivolous laws or radical laws or even experimental laws. He said that the laws that were being refused were wholesome and necessary. That cuts deep. It implies the laws weren't just popular, they were vital, essential to the health of society. And when government refuses such laws or just ignores such laws, it becomes very frustrating. It becomes very destructive. It undermines trust. It poisons the relationship between citizens and their leaders. And eventually, it should force us to ask the question of whether this government really represents us at all, or are we right back in 1776?
321-768-1240 if you've got questions or comments, and we continue in 1 minute on Bill Mick Live. Dave, let's wrap this up and we'll get to calls momentarily.
Well, let's bring it full circle. In 1776, Jefferson told the world that the king had refused his assent to wholesome and necessary laws. That was our breaking point. We could not live under a government that just ignored us. A decade later, 12 years later, James Madison would assure the Americans in Federalist 57 that such a thing could not happen again. Representatives would be tied to the people by frequent elections, bound by the very laws they passed, and always be accountable to the people. Congress would be responsible because the people, and responsive because the people demanded it. But Madison also added these words. He added a caveat that we often forget. If the government ever becomes unresponsive, the fault would not rest only with Congress. It would be because the people themselves had lost what he called the spirit of liberty. Should that spirit ever become so debased, he wrote, the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. And that's the point, the question we have to ask today. When bills are not being responded to, when our government is not being responsive, have we kept faith in the spirit of liberty? Have we kept our Congress accountable? Have we kept our president accountable, our courts accountable? Or have we let the spirit of liberty become so debased that we will tolerate anything but liberty?
Let's get to your calls. We'll start with line one. Good morning. You're on Bill Mick Live.
Good morning, guys. It's Eric in Brevard.
Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
So, for the professor here. I took your rhetorical question as actual, and are we not back there in that era? And the obvious literal answer is no, we're not. And I think the key difference, though, is though the problems seem similar, is that we as a people are so much different, right? And I know there's a lot of criticism going around today about politics being and everything, but what is your understanding of how politically active the citizens were of that day, maybe percentage-wise, and maybe why that might have been? I'm thinking the church being the center of the town and the pastors being well educated might have had something to do with it, but wanted to hear your take on that.
Dave, did you hear the question okay?
Yeah, I think so. It was long, but as far as how politically active people were, they were very politically active. Now, keep in mind that laws were different then. Women didn't have the vote. You had to own property, and those are issues that we're going to discuss later on. But for those who were, and even those that weren't, I mean, Dolly Madison is famous for her involvement. Abigail Adams, her letters, there is a lot of involvement. I get the sense from my own great-grandmother that she was, like they say, the man may be the head, but the woman is the neck. And so there's a lot of involvement there. I forgot the second part of the question. Sorry.
Percentage-wise, how politically active were they?
I would guess it was very high, certainly higher than the 20% that we get today, which is part of the problem.
Interesting.
Much part of the problem. This is. You're right. We live in a different world today. We live in a world where democracy has become confused with freedom. Democracy has become confused with liberty. Democracy is a system, and it's a system that should be used to protect liberty and freedom as opposed to attacking it. And unfortunately, reality is that democracy can quickly vote out those things, and this is where we are. And we keep re-electing congresspeople who have debased that spirit of liberty, as Madison wrote, to the point where we'll tolerate anything. And this is one of my frustrations. It's always other people's congressmen that are a problem. It's never mine. Maybe I should start holding mine accountable, and you should start holding yours accountable, and we'd get a better government.
Well, we do tend to see the ballot box as the path to making a difference, and I think it could, but it doesn't. We tend to think of it as the only path. Well, what about other paths? What's going to be effective in pushing that change?
Well, I think education is part of that key. I've long feared that we as Americans, we don't know this. I mean, literally, how many people knew assent of laws was our primary complaint when you got up this morning? Did you know that? I mean, I know you did because you read the notes, but everyone else? I don't know. Education has got to be the key, holding account, making Congress people accountable, making presidents accountable, and standing up for what we know is right and not making the excuse of, well, I like this, so it's okay. No. You either defend and support liberty or you don't.
Another stellar edition of Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. Dave, again, thanks for all the work. I know you put a lot into it to make it happen, and I hear regularly from this audience how much they appreciate it. So we'll take a look and see you next week on Tuesday, and look forward to that.
I'll see you then.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.